My name is Ione Salcedo. I turned 71 this past spring, and most days I still wake before dawn out of habit, the way I used to when the bookkeeping office opened early. I've always been orderly, the kind of woman who keeps her receipts and her feelings in separate drawers. Tonight, though both were hard to contain, Thanksgiving in Savannah had always meant noise children darting between rooms, the scent of roasted pecans and river air mixing through the open windows. This year, the streets were damp and quiet. I carried a pecan pie wrapped in a towel, the crust still warm, and walked toward my daughter's house on Whitaker Street, convincing myself the invitation might have simply been delayed. I saw the light before I heard the laughter. Arina's windows glowed amber against the drizzle, and silhouettes moved behind the sheer curtains. My two grandchildren, Sela and Oren, were running between the table and the kitchen. I stopped at the gate, my hand resting on the latch. Pie balanced carefully against my hip. That morning she had said it, her voice clipped and cool through the phone. "You don't even deserve the leftovers, Mother." I'd thought she was upset about something else, speaking out of stress. I told myself families said cruel things and forgot them by supper. But seeing them now, Quentin carving the turkey I had taught her to season with orange zest and thyme, there was no misunderstanding left. The glass held a reflection of my own face beside theirs, the outsider. My hair, silver and damp, stuck to my cheeks. My breath fogged the window. No one looked up. Arina passed the gravy boat to her husband and smiled the way she once smiled at me. I stood there until my arm began to ache from holding the pie. "So this is what family looks like without me," I murmured. My voice was steady, almost curious, when a gust of wind swept through the moss hanging over the sidewalk. It felt like a curtain closing. I set the pie on the stone step by the fence, turned, and started walking home. The drizzle had thickened to a slow, cold rain. By the time I reached my porch, the street lamps had blurred into soft halos. I hung my coat, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my ledger, the one I hadn't touched since last Thanksgiving. My hand no longer shook. There were figures to revisit, and a decision waiting between the pages. The morning light crept across the kitchen tiles, pale and cold, the way it always did after a sleepless night. I set a cup of coffee beside the old calculator that had survived 3 jobs and 1 marriage. Its buttons were faded, but it still added truth faster than feelings ever could. I pulled open the bottom drawer where I kept the papers Arina never knew existed. Folders labeled in my handwriting: steady, accountant's script, utilities, taxes, Holt support. The last one was thickest. Inside lay years of canceled checks, transfer slips, and property tax receipts. Every entry matched a date in the blue ledger on my table. After my husband died, Arina had been 29 and terrified of losing her first home. Quentin was already behind on bills from his remodeling business. "It's only temporary, Mom," she'd said then, voice trembling as she signed the papers. I believed her. That night comes back easily, the smell of paint still clinging to the house. Arina's tears landing on the mortgage application. I had co-signed, knowing full well she might never manage it alone. Later, when the payments began slipping, I quietly took over. I paid the property taxes directly to the county to protect her from foreclosure. She thought the city had granted a reduction. I never corrected her. For 8 years, I've been their invisible cushion. The ledger proves it. June 2017, county tax, $2,300. September 2019. Emergency contractor insurance, $785. March 2023. Tuition for Oren, private school deposit, $1,250. Every figure lines up neatly, as if precision could disguise foolishness. I once thought I was helping them build stability. Now it feels like I've built them a palace on sand. I set the ledger aside and opened a manila envelope marked legal copies. Inside was the document I drafted years ago with my lawyer, a license to occupy, granting Arina and Quentin the right to live in the house for so long as mutual respect and cooperation shall continue. The words looked formal, almost kind. They had seemed harmless when I wrote them. I traced the final clause with my finger. Mutual respect. A condition, not a promise. The coffee had gone cold by the time I closed the envelope. I slid it to the center of the table and straightened the edges until they were perfectly square. Generosity, I realized, had rules too. I had simply forgotten to enforce them. I woke before dawn, long before the city's first bus rattled down Whitaker Street. The house was still, the kind of stillness that follows an ending. I set out my old typewriter, the one I kept for legal letters, and rolled in a clean sheet of paper. My hands didn't tremble this time. At the top I wrote, "Notice of termination of license to occupy." The sound of the keys was sharp and certain. Each word closed a door that had been left ajar for too long. I typed what my lawyer had advised years ago, that the right to occupy my property would end 30 days from the date of the notice, effective immediately upon delivery. No explanation, no emotion, just facts. When I finished, I added photocopies of payment receipts, the ledger summaries, and a list of every expense I had covered since their move-in year property taxes, tuition, repairs, even the pest control visits Arina claimed to have scheduled. I folded everything neatly into a long white envelope and wrote on the front, in steady ink, for Arina and Quentin Holt. The last thing I included was not typed. On a smaller card, I wrote in my own hand, "When you can speak to me with respect, call. Until then, I'm done funding my own humiliation." Outside, the air was cool and faintly salty from the river. The streetlights hummed, throwing small circles of light across the sidewalk. I walked the few blocks to their house with the envelope tucked under my arm, passing the same stretch of moss-hung oaks that had once looked beautiful to me. Now they looked like witnesses. Their porch light was still on. I slid the envelope beneath the door and stood for a moment, hearing the muffled hum of their refrigerator inside. Then I turned and walked away before the sun came up. Later that morning, I imagined the sound of Arlina's slippers on the tile, the pause when she saw the envelope at her feet. I could see her tearing it open, expecting maybe a recipe or apology, then going pale as the truth unfolded page by page. Quentin would read over her shoulder, slower, more deliberate. He'd say it softly, not as comfort, but as warning. You pushed too far, and for once, he'd be right. By the third morning, the silence I had left behind began to echo back. My phone buzzed once. Then again, numbers I recognized but did not answer. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the leaves shift in the wind, counting the rings until they stopped. At first, the calls came from Arina, then from Quentin. By noon, a voicemail arrived, her voice sharp and shaking. "Mom, the bank says you withdrew as cosigner. Our credit line's frozen. They're saying they can't process payroll for Quentin's business until they verify new collateral. Call me back right now." I let the message finish. The next one followed within minutes. "The utilities won't clear. Do you understand what you've done? They're charging late fees. The preschool says Oren's tuition is suspended until next month. You can't just..." Her voice cracked. "You can't do this to us." The kettle whistled behind me, soft and steady. I poured more water and waited for my breathing to match its rhythm. That evening, Quentin called from their landline. He didn't waste words. "Mrs. Salcedo," he began, the politeness brittle. "Arlena's upset. I need to understand if you actually canceled everything." "I did," I said. "All accounts and authorizations have been closed." A pause. I could hear Arina in the background, her voice high and pleading. "You realize this puts us in a difficult position," Quentin continued. "I imagine it does," I replied. He exhaled through his nose. The sound clipped and tired. She thought you were just helping a little. She never knew the full amount. I know, I said quietly. That was my mistake. Arina took the phone from him. You can't just walk away, Mom. You helped us build everything, our home, our life. You can't abandon it now. It isn't yours to abandon, I said. It was never yours to own. Her breath hitched. You're punishing me for one comment, one stupid comment on Thanksgiving. I'm setting a boundary. I said, you confused them for the same thing for a long time. There was only the sound of her breathing, uneven and small. Then she whispered, almost to herself, she can't do this to us. Quentin's voice came faintly through the line. It was her money all along. Arina. I ended the call, turned off the ringer, and sat in the quiet that followed. The phone blinked with another missed call, then another. I let it ring until it stopped. The clerk at the county office had a gentle voice, the kind used for people who look like they might break. Yes, ma'am, she said, sliding the stamped form across the counter. Your notice was delivered and acknowledged yesterday morning. The occupants have 30 days to vacate. Thank you, I said, tucking the document into my folder. My tone was calm, almost businesslike. I had spoken those same words hundreds of times when closing accounts for clients, but never for my own child. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain and exhaust. I walked the few blocks to the realtor's office. The woman behind the desk, Marla Trent, hair pinned too tightly for comfort, looked up from her screen and smiled in that professional way that means everything is already arranged. Mrs. Salcedo, would you like me to relist the unit once they move out? It's a good market right now. Yes, I said. Not before January. Give them time. She hesitated. You're being generous. Not generous, I corrected softly. Just done. That afternoon, I ignored every call from Arina until one came from an unknown number. It was her voice anyway, frantic and high-pitched. The credit card company called again, she said without greeting. They're threatening legal action. Quentin's business account is frozen, and the bank says you revoked the guarantee. They won't even let us make payroll. I kept my tone even. You'll need to provide new collateral. That's what people do when they're independent. Independent, she snapped. You're proud of this, watching us drown. I'm tired of watching you float on money that isn't yours. I said, that night, as Savannah's humidity pressed against the windows. I pictured their kitchen, Quentin, at the table. Arina pacing with her phone. I didn't have to imagine what was said. I'd heard it before in other marriages, in other lives. You embarrassed me in front of your mother. He would tell her, his voice low, dangerous. Now we're broke. And she would cry because she knew it was true. Close to midnight. The phone rang again. I almost let it go to voicemail but lifted it anyway. Her voice was smaller this time. Mom, please, talk to me. You have 28 days left, I said quietly. Use them wisely. Before she could answer, I hung up. My hand trembled as I set the phone down. But it wasn't from guilt. It was relief, the kind that feels like the first breath after holding it for too many years. 2 weeks later, I drove down their street for the first time since Thanksgiving. The moving truck was already there, its ramp lowered like a tongue swallowing their belongings. I parked half a block away and watched from behind the wheel. Arina stood on the porch, giving directions to the movers with trembling hands. Her hair was tied back hastily, her face pale. A pile of cardboard boxes leaned against the railing, one marked kitchen, another books. She'd always said she hated clutter, yet now everything she owned looked like debris from a storm. Quentin paced the driveway, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and tight. Even from the car I could sense the blame rolling off him like heat. A neighbor, Mrs. Devereaux, stood by her fence, whispering to another woman. Their eyes followed every movement. I saw Arina catch their gaze, straighten her shoulders, and paste on a brittle smile. My daughter had always cared too much about appearances. Now she was performing collapse as if dignity alone could keep her standing. The children were harder to watch. Oren clutched a stuffed rabbit against his chest, eyes wide. The little one, Flora, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why isn't Grandma helping?" she asked. Arina knelt beside her, voice breaking. "Grandma's busy. Honey, she can't help this time." Flora sniffled, "But she always helps." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I had made this choice. Boundaries were supposed to hurt. That's what everyone said. They just never said whose heart would bruise first. When the last box disappeared into the truck, Arlena sank onto the porch step. Quentin didn't offer a hand. For a moment, she looked straight ahead past the movers, past the street, and her eyes met mine through the windshield. I wasn't sure if she truly saw me. I shifted the car into gear and drove away before I could find out. That night, the message arrived on my phone, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know." I read it twice, then turned the screen face down. On the kitchen table, the blue ledger waited open. I ran my fingers along the pages one last time, over the neat columns and faded ink. Every act of quiet mercy documented in numbers. Then I closed it and locked it away. The house was silent. For the first time, I wondered if silence could still count as strength when the person breaking beneath it was your own child. 3 months passed before Arlena's name appeared on my phone again. I almost didn't answer. But something in me, habit or hope, made my thumb press the screen. Her voice was smaller, steadier. "Mom, I got a job." I waited. "I'm cleaning offices downtown, night shifts. 4 hours a day. It's not much, but it's honest." She gave a short, nervous laugh. You'd be surprised how heavy a trash bin feels at 3 in the morning. There was no self-pity, only fatigue. "I'm glad you're working," I said quietly. "I've learned what leftovers really mean," she added after a pause. "They're what's left when everyone else has taken what they want, and you're still grateful there's something." The line went silent except for the hum of traffic behind her. Then she said, "I just wanted you to know. That night, I couldn't sleep." Her words lingered like the smell of bleach, stubborn and clean. 2 days later, I stopped by the old church downtown. Rosa Hernandez, a friend from choir years ago, now supervised the janitorial contracts for half the office buildings in the district. She met me in the foyer, wiping her hands on a rag. "I wondered when you'd come," she said with a knowing smile. "You want to hear how she's doing?" I nodded. "She's punctual, never complains, doesn't quit, even when her knees ache. The others like her. One man tried to tease her for being new, but she shut him down respectfully." Rosa chuckled. "You raised a proud one, Ione. Pride looks better scrubbed clean," I said. And Rosa gave me that look only women of our age know, half empathy, half warning. Before I left, I stopped by the small break room. The smell of coffee and disinfectant mixed in the air, on the table, next to a box of cheap pastries. I placed a sealed envelope. Inside was a grocery coupon worth $50 and a small note from a mother who believes in earning, no name, no signature. When I stepped back into the morning sun, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not triumph, not forgiveness, but a quiet kind of pride. The kind that grows only when both sides have bled for it. And I wondered if hard work, given time, might build something sturdier than forgiveness itself. By early spring, Arlena had found a small duplex near the river peeling paint, 2 narrow rooms, and a patch of yard just big enough for the children to chase each other in circles. She called it temporary, but I heard the pride in her voice when she said she'd signed the lease herself. The children started spending weekends with me again. They came carrying mismatched backpacks and questions too big for their ages. That first Saturday, as I stirred a pot of stew, little Selah sat on the counter swinging her legs. "Grandma," she said, serious as a judge. "What does leftover mean?" I stopped stirring. Her brother looked up from the floor, waiting. Something's still good. I told her, but forgotten for a while. If you warm it right, it can feed you again. She smiled. Like when Mom makes soup from old chicken. Exactly like that, I said, brushing a wisp of hair from her forehead. Later that evening, Arina arrived to pick them up. Her work clothes were clean but worn, and there were lines under her eyes I hadn't noticed before. She handed me a small envelope. It's not much, she said. Just $20 toward what I owe you. I'll send the same each month. I wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, but I stopped myself. Instead, I nodded. All right, I'm trying. Mom, I can see that, I said, and I meant it. By the next Sunday, I decided to make the old family stew again. The smell filled the house before noon onions, thyme, and something that always made the walls feel closer. When Arina arrived with the kids, she carried a small pot of rice and a loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel. I told the kids we'd bring something this time, she said. We set the dishes on the table, smaller now than the one she used to own, but full all the same. Sela served herself first, giggling as she spilled a little broth. Arina laughed softly. The sound cautious but real. When we finally sat down, there was no toast, no grand speech, just the quiet clinking of spoons and the sound of warmth returning to a room that had been cold too long. Love, I thought, doesn't always return in grand gestures. Sometimes it just learns to fit at a smaller table. A year later, the air carried that same November chill, but this Thanksgiving felt different. My house was full not of family in name, but of women who had lost and learned. Neighbors who brought laughter, and a handful of children chasing each other between chairs. I had decided on a potluck. Everyone was asked to bring something, no matter how small. The rule was simple. No one comes empty-handed. The doorbell rang just as I was setting the last bowl on the table. Arina stood there, holding a casserole wrapped in a towel. The children clutched paper napkins decorated with hand-drawn turkeys. We made sweet potato bake, she said softly. The kids helped. I stepped aside. Then come in before it gets cold. Inside, the guests greeted her kindly. A few of the older women offered knowing smiles, the kind that understood second chances better than sermons ever could. Arina placed her dish on the table, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small folded card. She slid it beside my plate without a word. When I opened it, the handwriting wavered, but was clear. Thank you for teaching me the difference between help and dependency. My throat tightened, but I managed a faint smile. And thank you, I said quietly, for remembering there's enough for everyone when everyone brings something. She met my eyes, and for the first time in years, there was no pride or shame, just peace. We sat together, passing bowls and sharing food that tasted better because it was shared. The children giggled when the cranberry sauce slid too fast from its dish, and laughter rippled through the room like light. Later, when dusk settled, I stepped out to turn on the porch light. The brass plate beneath it caught the glow, built by boundaries, kept by respect. I watched it shine across the walkway as the sound of voices and clinking plates filled my home. The table inside was smaller now, yes, but every seat at it was earned, and every smile was real.